Okay, let's dive right into this. We're looking at a fascinating, but honestly, a pretty grave chapter in the history of psychology. In today's explainer, we're going to trace the very origins of how the scientific measurement of human differences actually evolved. We're talking about that exact, pivotal moment when our totally natural desire to understand what makes us unique completely collided with the societal prejudices of the era.
Because, we really have to unpack a profound paradox here. How did scientific tools that were literally designed to help students end up morphing into weapons for discrimination? It serves as this massive cautionary tale about how seemingly objective science can be shaped and, as you'll see, deeply distorted by the underlying biases of its time. It's a powerful reminder that measurement, well, it's just a tool, not some absolute truth.
Section 1. The Origins of Measurement, Francis Galton and Individual Differences.
So we start our journey with Francis Galton. He was actually Charles Darwin's half-cousin, and he completely revolutionized the use of statistics in psychology. He even helped develop the whole concept of correlation. But here's the catch. He drew some profoundly flawed, hereditarian conclusions about human ability. He was absolutely convinced that genius was 100% inherited. Because of this, back in 1883, he coined the term eugenics, heavily advocating for the so-called improvement of the human race through selective breeding. And in doing so, he completely ignored the massive, undeniable roles that wealth, education, and social opportunity play in someone's success. And this perfectly highlights his core error. Galton was convinced nature was everything, that things like poverty and crime were simply biologically hardwired. But his fatal scientific flaw? He totally confounded heredity with environment. He'd look around, see that eminent, wealthy families produced eminent children, and bam, he confused correlation with causation. By completely ignoring environmental advantages, he essentially handed a stamp of scientific authority to discriminatory policies that were in reality just based on his own Victorian class prejudices. Which brings us to Section 2, from helping to sorting the subversion of Binet's test. Okay, so let's cross the Atlantic to France, where the intentions started out incredibly noble. In 1905, a French psychologist named Alfred Binet was given a specific job: identify students who needed special educational support. To do this, he developed the concept of mental age. But here is the crucial part. Binet explicitly warned against using his test to label children as permanently inferior. For him, intelligence was totally malleable. It was something you could actually improve through what he playfully called mental orthopedics. His entire motivation was purely humanitarian. He wanted a descriptive, qualitative lifeline to find out who needed help, definitely not a way to permanently box them in. But watch how fast things change. American psychologists, specifically a guy named Lewis Terman, took Binet's helping hand tool and fundamentally transformed it. Terman introduced the fixed IQ score. You know the one, mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. And just like that, literally almost overnight, a qualitative tool meant to identify struggling kids was weaponized into a rigid quantitative ranking system. It was suddenly being used for tracking, for social classification, and for basically dictating a person's permanent place in society. So that brings up a really critical, frankly unsettling question. What exactly happens when the tests themselves are culturally biased? To answer that, we have to look at Henry Goddard, who took these translated Binet tests straight to Ellis Island in 1913. The data he collected there is just staggering. Goddard tested these newly arriving immigrants under absolutely exhausting, highly stressful conditions. We're talking people fresh off the boat. The tests were frequently given in English to folks who didn't speak a word of it, and they relied heavily on specific American cultural knowledge. Because of this wildly flawed methodology, Goddard concluded that upwards of 80% of various immigrant groups were quote-unquote feeble-minded. Think about that number. And the worst part? These shocking, totally invalid data points were later explicitly used by lawmakers to justify the highly restrictive 1924 Immigration Act. It's a prime example of bad data permanently altering the lives of countless families. Let's move to Section 3, Mass Testing and War, the Army Alpha and Beta Tests. During World War I, the stakes got incredibly high, and the scale, massive. The military needed to process incoming recruits rapidly, marking the first real mass application of psychology. 1.75 million, that is the unprecedented number of men tested by the U.S. military. To pull this off, they rolled out 2 exams, the Army Alpha for literate soldiers, and the Army Beta, which was a pictorial test meant for illiterate or non-English-speaking recruits. Now, the Army Beta was heavily pitched as being culture fair, since you didn't need to read to take it. But the reality on the ground? Completely different. These tests were administered in awful, crowded, deafeningly noisy rooms. The instructions were often totally incoherent to the guys taking the test. On top of that, the picture questions still demanded a ton of American cultural knowledge, like knowing what a tennis court looked like or recognizing specific American advertising brands. I mean, come on. So naturally, the results yielded data of incredibly dubious validity. Yet, and here's the kicker, the data from this massive, flawed effort was still paraded around by many to defend eugenics, anti-Semitism, and really strict racial hierarchies.
All right, Section 4, Theories of Intelligence, Deconstructing What We Measure. So, while all these tests were being wildly misused in society and by the military, statisticians operating in the background were pulling their hair out trying to figure out what intelligence actually was. Enter a statistician named Charles Spearman. He noticed a really distinct pattern. People who score well on one type of cognitive test almost always tend to score well on others. He called this pattern a positive manifold. To get to the bottom of this, he actually invented a statistical technique called factor analysis. Spearman proposed that this overarching general mental energy, which he just called G for general intelligence, sat right at the top of a hierarchy, supported by S, representing our more specific skills. At the time, this was an absolutely revolutionary way to quantify human cognition. A bit later on, psychologist Raymond Cattell brilliantly refined this by splitting that general intelligence into two distinct types. First, you have fluid intelligence. Think of this as your raw processing power, your ability to solve completely novel problems on the fly. This peaks in your early 20s and then, well, sadly, it gradually starts to decline. But then there's crystallized intelligence. This is your accumulated knowledge, your vocabulary, your cultural know-how. And the beauty of this one is that it actually increases with age. It perfectly explains why your grandparents might, struggle a bit to set up a brand new smartphone, which leans heavily on fluid intelligence, but they possess this massive vocabulary and deep life wisdom thanks to their crystallized intelligence. Moving on to Section 5, the humanistic pushback, Gordon Allport's reaction. As the field of psychology became more and more obsessed with factor analysis, rigid IQ scores, and mass testing, a very necessary and very powerful humanistic pushback finally emerged. This was championed by psychologist Gordon Allport. Allport came out swinging against the nomothetic approach of standard psychometrics. That's the approach that's always seeking general laws, constantly trying to reduce incredibly complex human beings down to a single number sitting on a bell curve. Instead, Allport fiercely argued for an idiographic approach. He essentially said, look, if you just stare at a test score, you are completely missing the individual's unique configuration. You miss their conscious experience, their struggles, and their distinct, unquantifiable human potential. And Allport's insight? It is absolutely crucial for us to remember in today's world. He explicitly warned that excessive quantification can easily mask underlying values and assumptions. Think about it. When we reduce a living, breathing person to a mere data point, we inadvertently create this landscape where prejudice and exclusion can thrive, all hiding safely under the pristine guise of objective science. A number alone, no matter how rigorously calculated, simply cannot capture human worth. So, to kind of wrap up this cautionary tale, what have we learned? We've seen that while statistical measurement absolutely advanced psychology into a rigorous science, it brought along a terrifying dark side. When you strip humanism away from the data, simple numbers suddenly provide a chilling justification for horrible things. Forced sterilizations, restrictive immigration quotas, and deep systemic societal sorting. It really shows us, plain as day, how easily the authority of science can be bent to unjustly validate the specific prejudices of an era. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy but critical thought to carry forward as we close out this explainer. Today, we still rely so heavily on standardized testing, right? From getting into kindergarten to landing a corporate job, the concepts of G and IQ are still very much pulling the strings. So we really have to ask ourselves, as we utilize these modern tools, are we truly helping individuals reach their full potential? Or have we just invented more sophisticated ways of sorting them? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions, and I'll catch you next time.